Today I want to talk to you about research and publication in terms of what researchers are doing with their data. So we've talked about how does a researcher go about gathering their data? So now we want to talk about what they do with it. So once I have gathered my data for my research study, I'm going to write it up into a possible publishable research article, which includes an introduction to my topic. It includes a hypothesis, which is usually in the introduction section. Remember, hypothesis is a prediction statement that tells the reader what the researchers are studying. Then we're going to see a methods section where the researchers tell us exactly how they went about gathering their data, who their participants were, where they gathered their participants from, what they did to their participants. They give them a survey, were they in an experiment, what was the experimental manipulation, etc. And then we're going to see a results section where they're going to talk about the results of their data, and then a discussion section where they're going to tell us about, in words, what the numbers from the results section mean. And so in the discussion section is really where they're going to say that either our hypothesis was supported by our data or refuted by our data. One thing we want to keep in mind is that the word prove is really something that we want to avoid in our writing. It's something that we want to avoid in our speaking in general about anything, because almost any scientist will tell you that they are unable to prove without a doubt anything. So especially within the social sciences, especially when we're talking about human behaviors, we want to avoid using the word prove because it indicates 100%, and we know that there's no one behavior that every one person or every single person in the world does the same. So we want to avoid using prove, and we want to use what we call primary sources. So these primary sources are those research articles that researchers have written themselves about the data that they gathered. Some of the articles that students have used in the past couple of weeks in their discussion board posts have been what we call secondary articles or even tertiary sources. Secondary sources are articles written by people that are summarizing a primary source. So if I read a journal article and I summarize it, then what I'm creating is a secondary source. Now, if someone reads my secondary source, where I summarize the primary source, and writes about what I wrote, then that's a tertiary source, or a third step away from the actual research study itself. So when you're citing information, you really want to be citing primary sources. That's why it's important to use the library, look at the databases, make sure that an article is peer-reviewed, which means that that article has been reviewed by a group of the researchers' peers, so also professionals in the field who have experience with that topic, and they've made sure that the article and the conclusions that the writers came to have validity. And we also want to make sure that we're reading and writing about articles that are discussing research as opposed to discussing someone else's research. So primary sources are going to be important. Try to avoid tertiary sources where we're talking about someone who is reviewing someone else's review of an article. So if we're looking at a newspaper, many times that's a secondary or even sometimes a tertiary source. If you're on Wikipedia, sometimes you're even reading a tertiary source. So you want to avoid those types of sources. You want to actually go to the primary source, the actual article that was written by the researchers as they were supporting or refuting their hypothesis. And again, you can recognize one of those articles by making sure that you see a methods section in an article and that you see a results section in an article. If you don't see those two sections, then most likely you're looking at a review article, which is a type of article where people summarize the current status of a topic, or you're looking at a secondary source. So we want to make sure that our sources are primary sources as opposed to secondary or tertiary sources. If you have questions about vocabulary that's used in a primary source, make sure that you look it up. Don't just assume that you know what it means, or overlook it or ignore it, because unfortunately, when I read students' writings, I can tell you what students have found something that they didn't understand what it meant and just continued to use it in their writing even though they didn't know what that meant. Because if I know what it means and you don't, I can tell by how you write about it. So if you have questions about research, if you have questions about how to find primary sources, make sure that you use the resources that are available on Canvas to do so. And if you still have questions, make sure that you let me know. Thanks.